A warm, hazy summer evening settled over the countryside in June of 1954, the kind of quiet night where crickets filled the space between distant farm dogs and the glow of porch lamps seemed to hang in the air. Along Highway 17, a two-lane road that twisted through apple orchards and aging farmsteads, State Trooper Walter Hensley guided his dark green Plymouth Sedan through the last hour of his patrol. He had driven this same route for years, and people often said he could navigate it blindfolded. At 32, he carried a reputation for calm judgment and a steady voice, the kind of officer who remembered everyone's name and never made a family feel embarrassed when he pulled them over for a busted taillight. To most of the county, Walter wasn't just a trooper. He was one of their own. Sometime around dusk, a few residents sitting outside to escape the heat noticed his sedan rolling past the old orchard on the edge of town. The orchard had been there long before any of them were born. Rows of apple trees, some of them nearly skeletal with age, lining a fence that sagged in places from decades of windstorms. People recalled seeing the Plymouth glide by, its headlights flashing between the trunks. No one knew it then, but those passing glances would become the final confirmed sighting of Walter Hensley alive. When Walter failed to check in at the end of his shift, no one panicked at first. His radio had been spotty earlier in the afternoon, something that happened often in the low-lying stretches near the riverbeds. Dispatch tried again, waited, then tried once more. Still nothing. By the third attempt, the air inside the communication office tightened just slightly, though no one said a word about it. One of the supervisors made a quiet call to another trooper on duty, asking him to swing by the usual patrol path just in case Walter had pulled off to help a stranded driver. That explanation felt plausible, even comforting, but deep down everyone understood Walter never missed a check-in without a reason. As the sun slipped behind the hills and the horizon turned a muted gold, two patrol cars rolled onto Highway 17 and began tracing the route Walter should have returned on. The officers drove slowly, scanning shoulders, culverts, and turnouts. They checked the spots where injured deer sometimes wandered onto the road, and the pullovers where truckers liked to take smoke breaks. They expected to catch the familiar glint of a roofline or the shine of chrome. Instead, they found nothing. The highway looked untouched, as if the last person to travel it had been Walter himself. When the first hour passed without contact, the search widened. More troopers were called in. Vehicle records were checked. Fuel logs confirmed Walter had left the station with a full tank. Dispatch retraced every call he'd made that day, looking for anything unusual, but everything pointed to a routine patrol. No disturbances. No warnings. No sign he was following anyone or had pulled anyone over. But the deeper the search became, the more the quiet dread settled in, not because there was evidence of something terrible, but because there wasn't. Just after full dark, a patrol unit cruising past the orchard caught something faint in the beam of its headlights. A single-tire skid, barely visible, cut across the gravel shoulder at an angle before disappearing near the broken section of fence. The troopers stopped, stepped out, and felt the unsettled weight of silence pressing against the orchard's edge. When they walked closer, they saw that the skid mark didn't lead to a crash site or a ditch. It simply vanished into the grass, swallowed by the earth and the roots and the shadows beneath the apple trees. They pushed deeper into the orchard, calling Walter's name, expecting to see his sedan tucked against one of the rows. But the orchard was still. The ground was soft from recent rain, and their flashlights cut across patches of mud that held no fresh tire tracks, just the impressions of their own boots. It made no sense. The skid mark was real, but it wasn't leading them anywhere. It was as if the road itself had swallowed the car whole. News traveled faster than anyone expected. House by house, porch by porch, the word spread that something was wrong. Families stepped outside, watching the flare of searchlights sweep across distant fields. Some people climbed into their own trucks and drove slowly along back roads, hoping to spot the trooper's car hidden behind a tree line or stuck near a ditch. Others gathered on their porches, whispering theories that ranged from the familiar to the unsettling. Out here, everyone knew everyone, so the idea that a local officer could simply vanish didn't fit into the way the town understood the world. By midnight, the search had grown. Deputies from the next county arrived. Volunteers followed. They checked barns, hunting shacks, and abandoned service roads. Someone suggested draining the old irrigation pond, but it would take days to set up the equipment. Someone else wondered if Walter had taken a call that never went through the radio. A senior trooper made the uncomfortable remark that if someone had planned to take a police officer, this stretch of road, bordered by miles of farmland and only a few occupied houses, was the perfect place to do it. People didn't respond well to that comment, even suggesting it made the threat real. Back at the Hensley home, Walter's wife Margaret waited with her parents, her hands clasped so tightly they were turning white. She had always worried about the job but trusted Walter's instincts. He knew how to handle drunks, how to calm hostile drivers, how to defuse confrontations before they spiraled. The idea that he hadn't come home because he simply couldn't wasn't something she was ready to let herself believe. The troopers at her house avoided telling her too much, but their silence between sentences weighed more heavily than their words. As the night dragged on, every new detail only deepened the confusion. One resident living near the highway said he heard a car engine accelerate around dusk, but couldn't tell if it was Walter's or just one of the local boys heading home before dark. Another swore he'd seen the Plymouth turn into the orchard entrance, though the angle made that impossible unless Walter had been chasing someone off-road. None of the accounts lined up cleanly. They were fragments, enough to create possibilities, but never enough to build certainty. By 3 a.m, the search teams regrouped on the road, exhausted, clothes damp with sweat and humidity. Nothing concrete had been found. No footprints leading into the trees. No broken branches suggesting a struggle. No radio, no badge, no sign of the sedan. Only that faint skid mark and a fence that looked like it had been leaned on rather than crashed through. The orchard swayed quietly in the night breeze, its branches brushing one another like whispers. Every trooper there had searched difficult scenes before, but the emptiness of this one felt different, as if something had happened just out of sight, then erased itself before anyone arrived. When dawn approached and the sky shifted into a pale blue, the searchers paused. The light revealed the orchard clearly now, the rows of trees casting long shadows across the grass, the broken section of fence lying exactly where it had the night before, untouched and undisturbed. The morning haze gathered near the ground, drifting between the roots like a curtain. To some of the officers, it felt like the orchard was holding its own secrets, refusing to give them up. Word of the troopers' disappearance spread beyond the county by breakfast. Newspapers called for statements. State police headquarters demanded every detail. The governor wanted hourly updates. But all they had to report was absence, a man gone, a vehicle gone, and an orchard that had swallowed the last moments of his known path. By mid-morning, rumors had already begun circulating, that Walter had been ambushed, that he'd stumbled on a crime in progress, that he'd chased someone into the orchard and never come out. None of it was backed by evidence, but people needed a story, something to hold on to while the truth refused to surface. The sun rose fully over the trees, warming the road and drying the dew from the grass. The troopers returned to the orchard for another sweep, still believing the car had to be somewhere close. No officer, no vehicle, no clue could vanish without a trace. Not out here, not in a place this familiar. But as they walked the rows again, a quiet unease settled in behind them. It didn't feel like they were searching for a man who had simply gotten lost or had an accident. It felt like they were searching for something that had been deliberately hidden. And though no one said it aloud, every person present felt the same thing rising in their gut, that whatever had happened the night before was far from over, and the orchard was only the beginning of a mystery they were nowhere near ready to understand. By the time the sun rose over the orchard the next morning, the quiet farmland that usually woke to tractors and birdsong was already crowded with patrol cars from 3 different counties. Their engines idled in the damp morning air, while officers gathered in small groups, rubbing last night's exhaustion from their eyes. Word of Trooper Walter Hensley's disappearance had traveled faster than anyone expected, and the orchard, once a harmless patch of aging apple trees, now felt like the center of something heavy and wrong. Deputies stepped carefully over the broken section of fence, their boots sinking into the soft ground as they tried to make sense of the faint skid mark that had been spotted the night before. It was still there, angled toward the orchard as if someone had lost control or been forced off the road, but it ended too sharply, like it had been erased by the night. The orchard's owner, an elderly farmer named Royce Ellison, stood with arms folded behind one of the patrol cars. He had lived beside those trees for almost 50 years and claimed he slept light enough to hear raccoons in his shed. Yet he swore he hadn't heard a vehicle, a scream, or anything that sounded like a struggle. Officers believed him, not because of his reputation, but because nothing about his expression suggested deception. He looked confused, almost ashamed, as if the ground itself had betrayed him. When investigators walked him to the tree line and pointed out the churned soil and snapped branches, his face drained. He insisted again that he'd slept through the night, unaware that any of this had taken place just beyond his bedroom window. Soon, tracking dogs were brought in, their handlers moving slowly through the orchard, weaving between rows of trees whose branches hung low with unripe apples. The dogs picked up Walter's scent almost immediately from items pulled from his locker, tugging toward the same section of the tree line where officers believed something had happened. For several minutes, there was hope, something hard, focused, and promising. But the scent trail stopped abruptly 50 yards in, right where the ground turned muddy from recent rain. The dogs circled, confused. Handlers tried again. Same result. The scent didn't fade. It simply ended as if Walter had vanished into the ground. Investigators moved deeper into the orchard, marking disturbed soil with flags and collecting samples from broken twigs, hoping for fingerprints or fibers. They found neither. What they did find is a patch of earth that had clearly been churned by something heavy, a vehicle, perhaps, but the shape wasn't right. It was too shallow, too broad, too inconsistent. Detectives debated whether it was old damage from farm equipment, and though the farmer insisted he hadn't driven anything through that part of the orchard in months, no one could be certain. By midday, officers expanded the search perimeter. The irrigation pond behind the orchard, dark, stagnant, and nearly 6 feet deep, was flagged for inspection. A small boat was pushed out, and officers dropped weighted hooks into the murky water, dragging the bottom in slow, methodical sweeps. A few times they snagged on something, and hearts jumped, but each drag brought up the same things: branches, clumps of grass, debris from the previous autumn. The sedan wasn't there, nor any sign of a body. As the day heated, more officers arrived from the state police. They combed the adjoining fields, checked fence posts for paint transfer, examined the gravel shoulder for fragments of glass. A forensics team sifted soil near the orchard entrance, fearing they might uncover something they weren't ready to see. But there was nothing. The trail ended before it even began. Then the rumors started. It began with a whisper among a group of local men leaning against a truck bed, watching the search unfold. One man claimed Walter must have pulled over the wrong driver, someone passing through, someone armed. Another insisted it had to be an ambush planned by people who knew his route. Someone else suggested a lover's meeting gone wrong, though the theory collapsed when reminded that Walter was known for being devoted to his wife. Yet rumors never needed truth to spread. They only needed fear. By afternoon, stories reached the nearby diner that moonshiners operating in the hills had taken revenge on Walter for a recent arrest, that an escaped convict had been seen on an old logging road, that Walter had discovered something at the orchard he wasn't meant to see. Nobody had proof, but everyone had a theory. The quiet town, normally bound by routine, suddenly felt like a place where danger lurked in the spaces between trees. The sheriff's department tried to stay ahead of the rumors, but they were understaffed, overwhelmed, and confused themselves. Many of the deputies had worked with Walter for years. They then found themselves searching under brush piles and inside abandoned shacks with a level of dread they weren't used to. For them, this wasn't just a case. It was personal. And the lack of evidence felt like a slow suffocation. That night, when families gathered for supper, the conversation at every table centered on the same topic. Children asked why there were so many police cars. Parents told them not to worry, even though they did. Some mothers started forbidding their kids from wandering near the orchard or the back roads. Some fathers quietly loaded their shotguns, leaning them by the kitchen door, just in case. When darkness fell again, porch lights snapped on earlier than usual, and doors were locked before the sky even turned black. In the days that followed, investigators broadened their efforts. They mapped every road within 10 miles, looking for skid marks or abandoned vehicles. They questioned farmers, truckers, field hands, anyone who had passed through the area the night Walter vanished. Some people remembered hearing a car engine accelerating near dusk. Others swore they saw headlights near the orchard at a strange angle. But every account contradicted another. Investigators logged each one carefully, but none of them provided direction. They dug through brush piles, searching for clothing or metal scraps. They sifted through shallow ditches. They checked the creek bed downstream, even though the water was barely knee-high. 2 officers drove along the highway shoulder in opposite directions, hoping to catch sunlight glare off chrome, but found nothing except scattered gravel and sun-baked asphalt. When the irrigation pond failed to yield results, the state police ordered it completely drained. This took 2 days. Mud cracked under the sun. Officers waded through the thick sludge left behind, hoping to find even a piece of the Plymouth's chrome trim or the radio antenna. They found only rocks and old tools lost by farmhands years before. Some investigators began to question whether Walter had ever made it beyond the orchard at all. Others wondered if he'd been forced back onto a different road where he'd been ambushed. The theories multiplied. Leads did not. A week passed. Then, two. The orchard became a magnet for attention, drawing curious onlookers who leaned against the fence and stared into the rows of trees as if expecting answers to appear between the branches. What once had been a harmless piece of local farmland now carried a quiet dread. People lowered their voices when they drove past it, as though speaking too loudly might disturb something lurking underground. Officers returned again and again, refusing to let the orchard slip into the category of searched and cleared. They combed it in grits. They used metal detectors. They dug shallow trenches in areas where the soil seemed too loose or too recently filled. But they found nothing. No tracks. No fibers. No blood. No personal items. Not even a crushed blade of grass that could definitively be tied to the missing trooper. Some began to fear they were searching the wrong place. Some feared they were searching the right one. As weeks turned into a month, the edges of the investigation began to fray. Troopers who once spoke confidently about finding Walter now admitted quietly to one another that they didn't know what they were dealing with. The orchard had become a symbol, not of hope or closure, but a question nobody could answer. Parents reminded their children not to wander past its fence. Young couples chose different places to park their cars at night. Even seasoned officers avoided being alone there after sundown. By late summer, the orchard stood exactly as it had before Walter disappeared, unchanged despite the enormous search efforts that had taken place within its boundaries. The rows of trees bore fruit, the wind rustled their branches, and the grass grew back over disturbed soil. But for the people living in the town, the orchard wasn't the same anymore. It held the weight of something buried, not a body, not evidence, but uncertainty. A lingering sense that whatever had happened within those rows was not finished with them yet. And as investigators prepared to shift the search toward distant roads and out-of-county leads, they couldn't shake the feeling that the orchard had more to tell, something just beneath the surface, waiting. By the time autumn settled across the county, the search for Trooper Walter Hensley had shifted from urgent to exhausted. The orchard's leaves had begun falling in slow spirals, covering the disturbed soil where officers had walked in tight grids for weeks. The rows of apple trees grew quiet again, and the yellow crime scene tape that once fluttered between their trunks had long been removed. Though patrol units still drove past the orchard each night, their headlights no longer lingered. The case that had once consumed every trooper in the district now sat in the corner of a desk inside headquarters, growing colder with each passing day. State Police issued a formal missing in action notice in late October. It was a thin two-page summary of a man who should have been easy to find but wasn't. It listed the night he vanished, the stretch of road he patrolled, the make and model of his sedan, and the last known sighting near the orchard at dusk. The notice felt final in a way that unsettled everyone who read it. It didn't accuse anyone, didn't present a theory, didn't suggest foul play or an accident. It simply acknowledged that an officer had disappeared, and the department could no longer say why. For Walter's wife, Margaret, the declaration changed everything. It wasn't closure, not even close, but it was the moment she understood the state had moved on. She quietly decided she wouldn't. In the weeks that followed, she began her own search, one without badges or official authority, but with a determination that startled some of the people she questioned. She visited farms along Highway 17, bringing a notebook she filled with careful handwriting. She asked truckers if they remembered seeing a patrol car pulled off the road that night, or if anyone had flagged them down. She approached traveling salesmen at gas stations and diners, asking if they had passed through on the evening Walter vanished. Some were polite. Some were uncomfortable. Most didn't know anything. But Margaret showed each of them a small photo she kept in her purse, a picture of Walter leaning against his Plymouth, smiling, and she watched their faces for the slightest flicker of recognition. Her search didn't result in breakthroughs, but it brought new fragments of information. A farmer swore he saw headlights parked near the orchard and usually late that night, though he couldn't say if it was Walter's car. A trucker insisted he passed a dark sedan traveling fast toward the hills, though he wasn't sure of the date. A waitress said she overheard two men talking about trouble near the orchard, but she never caught their names. Margaret copied all of it into her notebook, then rewrote it again at home, trying to arrange the fragments into something that made sense. But no matter how she combined them, they refused to form a picture she could trust. Years slipped by in slow, painful increments. Patrol methods modernized. Radios became clearer. The orchard changed owners twice, each new family pruning the trees, replacing broken fence posts, planting new saplings where old ones had died. Each spring, fruit hung heavy from the branches, and locals returned to buying crates for cider and pies. From the outside, the orchard looked unchanged, healthy, productive, ordinary. But the families who lived nearby always noticed the same thing. No matter who owned it, the orchard's reputation never recovered. It wasn't cursed, people said. It was simply a place that held a question no one could answer. Inside the state police archives, Walter's file remained frustratingly thin. Investigators had taken nearly 50 witness statements, most of them contradictory. A few people claimed they saw the sedan turn off the road. Others insisted they saw it continue straight. One man swore he heard a gunshot, though he later admitted he wasn't sure it hadn't been fireworks from a church picnic. There were reports of a strange car parked along the highway for several nights before the disappearance, but the descriptions were inconsistent. Light-colored, dark-colored, old, new. A single untraceable radio signal, recorded by dispatch as a faint burst of static at 8:22 p.m., was included in the file, though no one could confirm whether it came from the Plymouth or a passing trucker. For every clue collected, there were two reasons not to trust it. By the early 1960s, a new generation of officers joined the department. Men who had heard the story of Walter's disappearance but had not lived through the search. To them, it was a cautionary tale, a lesson about routine patrols and isolated stretches of road. The file sat untouched for long intervals, reopened only when a new sergeant wanted to impress his commanding officer by revisiting an old mystery. Each time the review ended the same way. No leads, no evidence, no direction. But in 1963, something unexpected arrived. A young detective named Glenn McCrae, ambitious, sharp, and known for his persistence, received an anonymous letter at the station. The envelope had no return address and no name inside. The handwriting was slanted and rushed. The message was brief, only 3 sentences long, but it claimed that Walter had seen something he wasn't supposed to see the night he vanished. The letter suggested he wasn't the intended target, that he walked into a situation that wasn't meant for him. It warned that the truth was still hidden in the place where the trees meet the dark. The wording was strange, cryptic, but enough to catch Glenn's attention. He reopened the case immediately, reviewing every note, every map, every photograph taken in the orchard. He drove the route Walter drove, stopping at each turnout, studying the land. He visited the orchard's new owner, walking the perimeter alone for hours. The letter had revived a sense of urgency that the department hadn't felt in years. For a brief moment, it seemed like the case had life again, like the silence might finally break. Glenn tried to track down the sender, but the letter's paper and ink revealed nothing helpful. Postal workers couldn't recall who mailed it. The envelope lacked fingerprints. No one else received a similar message. The detective began interviewing people connected to the orchard, including former workers and neighbors who had moved away. He found no one who admitted to writing the letter. But he did find a handful of longtime locals willing to share stories they had never told police. Stories about vehicles seen late at night, about strangers passing through, about whispered threats exchanged between men involved in illegal hauling operations in the 1950s. For several months, Glenn pushed the investigation forward with a determination that made some of his colleagues uneasy. He believed the letter was genuine. He believed someone out there knew what happened to Walter. But just when he was ready to issue a formal request to dig several areas of the orchard again, the lead collapsed. The anonymous sender vanished. Whoever had mailed the letter never contacted the police again, never revealed a name, never hinted at their identity. A follow-up letter never arrived. Glenn waited for months, then reluctantly accepted that the single clue he had was no longer enough to justify the resources he needed. The case was closed once more. The orchard continued to thrive. The trees grew thicker, healthier. Fruit came in heavy each season. Families visited for apple picking, stepping unknowingly over the same soil investigators had studied years earlier. Children ran between rows that had once been cordoned off with yellow tape. Weekend festivals were held there. To the town, the orchard had returned to normal. But to those who remember the search in 1954, the troopers who had walked the rows in silence, the families who had waited on porches for news, the wife who kept a notebook of every rumor and forgotten detail, It never felt normal again. There was something uncomfortable about the orchard's success, a strange dissonance between its thriving branches and the memory of a man lost somewhere along its edges. And year after year, as the fruit grew heavier and the trees grew thicker, the truth beneath the soil stayed exactly where it had always been, out of reach, out of sight, and waiting. In the summer of 1978, the county fell under a heat so relentless it felt like the land itself was shrinking. Rain clouds passed overhead without breaking, crops browned at the edges, and the river that once flooded freely in spring narrowed into a sluggish trickle. Farmers walked their property lines with worry etched into their faces, knowing the ground was drying faster than their wells could keep up. No one felt the drought more sharply than the workers at the old orchard, now owned by a new family who had ambitious plans to modernize the place. They spent long days surveying cracked soil and watching the earth pull away from the roots of the trees, trying to figure out where to dig a new trench for irrigation lines that might save at least part of the harvest. On a cloudless July afternoon, a small crew began trenching along the western edge of the orchard, an area most of them barely paid attention to because the soil was usually soft and the ground stayed damp throughout the year. But the drought had lowered the groundwater dramatically, and the earth there had hardened enough for heavy machinery to move through without sinking. The operator of the backhoe eased the bucket into the dirt, expecting to lift out clumps of dry soil. Instead, he felt a jarring resistance, a metallic thud that vibrated through the controls in a way no stone or root ever had. He raised the bucket and tried again, this time nudging the teeth into the earth more gently. The machine struck the same obstruction. Beneath the inch-thick topsoil, something solid and flat lay hidden. The operator killed the engine and signaled the others over. The workers crouched near the shallow trench, brushing the dirt aside with gloved hands until the curved edge of a smooth metal surface emerged, painted once, now dull from decades underground. They stepped back slowly, each of them exchanging uneasy glances. This wasn't equipment. It wasn't a tank or a pipe. It was something far larger. The orchard manager, startled by the commotion, walked over and immediately ordered the crew to stop digging. Whatever they had found, it wasn't ordinary, and it wasn't something they should disturb. He made a call to the county sheriff, who then contacted state police. The message was brief, but enough to send a shiver through the department. Metal discovered beneath the orchard, possibly automotive. For officers who remembered the early days of the Hensley disappearance, the location alone was enough to send several patrol cars racing toward the property. When the first officers arrived, the workers were standing a few feet back from the shallow trench, their expressions a mix of curiosity and dread. The officers stepped into the ditch and brushed away more soil until a faint ridge revealed itself, a roof seam. Another few inches of careful clearing showed the gentle curve of 1950s-era roofline. The orchard manager recognized it instantly, not because he knew cars, but because everyone in the county had heard the story. It was the shape of a Plymouth Sedan. The orchard was shut down within the hour. Workers herded visitors toward the exit while state police erected barricades along the perimeter. No one fought the restrictions. Word spread through town with startling speed, and by early evening, a small gathering had formed along the orchard fence. People whispered to one another, unable to reconcile the shock settling over them. For 24 years, the search for Trooper Walter Hensley had circled this orchard over and over. The fact that his vehicle might have been here the entire time felt impossible. Forensic teams arrived from the capital the next morning, armed with maps, excavation tools, and the grim understanding that whatever they found beneath the soil had been there for decades. The drought made their work easier. The ground was brittle, breaking apart in chunks instead of clinging to itself. Still, they moved slowly, almost painfully so, brushing away dirt by hand to avoid damaging the buried object. When the first full section of the roof appeared, dented inward, crushed by years of weight, several officers found themselves staring at it in silence. The vehicle was upside down, the roof flattened, its frame warped. Dense apple roots wrapped around a metal like a net, as if the orchard had grown over it deliberately. The forensic lead specialist remarked that the roots had been growing for decades, winding through every crease and seam, anchoring the car in place. That meant the Plymouth had likely been buried when the orchard looked very different, before new trees were planted, before the soil had shifted, before modern irrigation. As more earth was pulled away, the distinctive lines of the 1950s Plymouth came fully into view. Even through rust and dirt, the car's shape was unmistakable. Several older residents who had come to watch began to cry softly, not from grief but from the weight of a mystery that had finally revealed itself after nearly a quarter century. Some had been teenagers when Walter disappeared, and seeing the car felt like watching a ghost surface from the ground. Detectives clustered near the excavation site, lowering their voices as they tried to understand how an entire vehicle could have remained hidden here for so long. They had dug parts of this orchard before. They had walked it, measured it, mapped it, and still found nothing. One detective suggested that whoever buried the car knew exactly where search teams focused their efforts in 1954 and took advantage of blind spots. Another argued that the car might have been buried after the initial search, when attention shifted elsewhere. But that seemed impossible. The roof was crushed in a way that suggested pressure from years of soil and root growth. The orchard had buried it slowly, naturally. This wasn't the work of a quick overnight cover-up. As the investigation team kept digging, the community along the fence grew. Older residents held onto the rails for support, their hands trembling. Younger ones listened quietly, finally seeing evidence of a story they had grown up hearing whispered among adults. Every person there felt the same question grinding at them. If the car had been here all along, why hadn't they found it the first time? Had the search truly missed it, or had someone ensured it would stay hidden? By the third day, excavation crews had cleared enough dirt to expose nearly half the car. Its underside faced upward, the exhaust pipe twisted, the suspension frozen in place. Even without opening the doors, detectives could tell the vehicle had been placed deliberately, perfectly aligned with the trench, positioned in a shallow pit that must have been dug by heavy equipment. The orchard owner who lived there in the 1950s, long deceased, had always insisted he heard nothing the night Walter disappeared. But now investigators wondered if he had been involved, or if someone had used his property without his knowledge. Questions multiplied faster than answers. Who had access to machinery capable of digging a pit large enough to hide a car? When had they done it? Why wasn't the sound of the engine or digging equipment reported by neighbors? The most troubling question hovered unspoken until finally someone murmured it aloud. If the car was here, what about Walter? Forensics teams continued their slow, methodical excavation, hoping to uncover a door handle or window frame that could lead to the interior. They expected the worst, and privately, most officers braced themselves to find human remains. But as daylight faded on the third day, the soil surrounding the driver's door remained tightly packed, reinforced by thick, hardened roots. The orchard had truly absorbed the vehicle, wrapping it in its own living structure. It would take more time, possibly several more days, before the team could access the inside. Night after night, officers stayed at the orchard to ensure no one interfered. Locals left food for them, as if trying to repay the effort from decades before. And each morning, more people gathered along the fence, driven by a need to witness the truth finally rising from the ground. By the end of the week, the orchard felt exactly as it had in 1954, heavy with tension, buzzing with theories, and filled with unanswered questions. Except now, there was something tangible to look at, something the county had stopped believing they would ever see. The orchard had surrendered a secret, one it had held tightly through ownership changes, changing seasons, and countless harvests. And as detectives huddled around the half-exposed Plymouth, they all felt the same thing. The case that had once gone silent had begun speaking again. And whatever they found inside that car would determine whether the truth was finally within reach, or whether the orchard still had more to hide. By the following morning, the orchard looked less like farmland and more like a military site. Floodlights glared through the thinning trees as a crane lowered heavy straps around a half-exposed Plymouth. Investigators stood in a tight semicircle, their faces tense, waiting to see what condition the vehicle was in beneath the hardened soil. The drought had dried the ground enough to reveal the roofline, but the rest of the car was still lodged deep in compacted earth and decades of tangled roots. When the crane finally lifted, the orchard let out a low groan, the soil cracking, the roots stretching, as the Plymouth rose slowly into the daylight for the first time since 1954. The car hung in the air for several seconds, dripping loose dirt, its crushed frame casting a warped shadow across the trench. People along the fence didn't speak. They just stared, stunned that something buried this perfectly could have been missed for so long. Once the vehicle was secured, a flatbed truck transported it to a secured hangar outside town, where investigators could examine it without interruption. It was there, under the buzz of fluorescent lights, that the state police finally saw the full extent of what the earth had preserved. The windshield had been shattered inward, not cracked from age or roots, but forced as though struck from the outside. The damage was sharp, intentional, not the kind that happens naturally underground. The driver's door was bent unnaturally at the hinge, as if someone slammed it shut on something or someone trying to get out. Rust coated the edges of the frame, but the pattern of the bend was unmistakable. This wasn't weather damage. This was force. Inside the car, the interior was packed with soil, leaves, and thin roots that had infiltrated the seats. But beneath the decay, investigators found items that brought the room to a standstill. Lying on the floorboard was Trooper Hensley's hat, crushed but still recognizable. His badge, once polished bright, was now rusted to a dull brown. It had been resting against the passenger side, half buried in the dirt. And on the seat, wedged against what remained of the steering column, was a small, crumpled incident card, the kind troopers used to jot down quick details before filing a full report. Most of the ink had faded, but a few words were still legible. Stopped one male, uncooperative. The room fell silent. The incomplete sentence felt like a voice frozen mid-breath, a final glimpse into the last minutes of Walter's patrol. Investigators studied the handwriting, and though the letters were distorted by moisture and time, they matched the samples in Walter's file. He had written those words. He had started documenting an encounter, and he had never finished it. But the strangest piece of the puzzle was what wasn't in the car. There was no body, no remains, no sign that Walter had died inside the vehicle before it was buried. The only human trace was the objects he left behind, abandoned abruptly in a moment of chaos. The absence of remains didn't reassure investigators. It troubled them. If Walter wasn't in the car, where had he gone? And why bury the vehicle instead of abandoning it somewhere remote? Forensic analysts moved quickly. Soil samples were scraped from the undercarriage, the wheel wells, the interior. Laboratory testing revealed something startling. The soil tightly packed around the car didn't match the orchard's natural sediment layers. It had been disturbed, moved, and compacted within a narrow window. Estimates indicated the car was buried no later than 24 hours after Walter vanished. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. Someone had waited for darkness, used heavy machinery, and buried the Plymouth in a pit deep enough to conceal it for decades. That meant access to equipment, privacy, knowledge of the land, and a willingness to take a massive risk. When investigators examined the angle of the crushed roof and the pattern of stress along the front bumper, a new theory formed. The sedan hadn't simply been lowered into the ground. It had been driven or pushed forward into a pit before being covered. The soil around the grille was compressed differently than the soil near the trunk. That indicated forward momentum, not passive placement. Someone had driven or forced the car into a grave. As detectives pieced together the burial timeline, another question emerged. Who had control over the orchard land at the time? Ownership records were pulled from county archives, fragile papers handled with care. The orchard had changed hands many times, but one detail stood out sharply. Just 3 days before Walter vanished, the land underwent a sudden transfer. The buyer was a man named Ernest Mallory, a hauling contractor who ran a small fleet of earth-moving trucks and loaders. On paper, the sale looked legitimate, but the timing sent a jolt through the investigative team. Mallory had been known locally for his temper and for operating in the gray areas of hauling contracts. Rumors of criminal dealings swirled around him for years. Illegal dumping, unlicensed excavation work, under-the-table jobs for men who wanted holes dug without paperwork. Nothing had ever stuck, but his reputation lingered. When detectives tried to track him down, they hit another wall. Mallory had left the state abruptly in early 1955, less than a year after Walter disappeared. He never returned, and no one knew exactly why. As investigators dug deeper, old informants admitted that Mallory had ties to men running illegal operations in the nearby hills, especially moonshine equipment transport and off-record land clearing. If Walter's last note, stopped one male, uncooperative, referred to Mallory or someone connected to him, the motive became chillingly simple. Walter may have interrupted something that night. Something big enough that the men involved decided burying a patrol car was their only way out. The evidence was circumstantial, but powerful. The car had been buried with precision. Mallory had the equipment. He had the experience. He had motive, and he had vanished before anyone could question him. Investigators mapped the orchard as it existed in 1954 and discovered another detail that sharpened the theory. The pit where the car had been buried lined up with an area previously used for soil dumping during orchard renovations. That meant Mallory knew exactly where to dig without attracting attention. A truck could have driven onto the property late at night, dug the pit, pushed the car inside, and covered it before dawn, all without anyone nearby hearing a thing. Every detail pointed to a staged burial. Calculated, efficient, designed to erase a vehicle, a patrolman's last moments, and whatever crime he stumbled into. When detectives stood in the hangar that evening, staring at the rusted shell of the Plymouth, the weight of what they were seeing began to sink in. The orchard hadn't just kept a secret. It had kept a secret that someone had worked desperately hard to bury. And though investigators now had a probable suspect, they still didn't have the one thing the family needed most. They had the car, the clues, the timeline, the likely motive, but they didn't have Walter. That absence hung in the air like something unfinished, stretching a silence across the hangar that none of them could ignore. And for the first time in decades, the investigation felt like it was moving again, toward someone who wasn't missing, but toward a truth that had been buried almost as deeply as the car itself. By 1982, the orchard had long since returned to its familiar rhythm. New owners had come and gone. New rows of saplings had been planted. The discovery of the Plymouth 4 years earlier had stirred the community in ways that still echoed quietly, but daily life had resumed. Most people accepted that the investigation, though revived, would likely never reach a clean conclusion. The hauling contractor, Ernest Mallory, was dead. His rumored associates were either untraceable or unwilling to talk. And with no remains, no witnesses, and no new evidence, the case once again hovered in that painful space between closure and uncertainty. Then, on an ordinary winter afternoon in January, police received a call from a small rural hospice facility 2 counties away. The nurse who placed the call sounded hesitant, unsure whether what she had heard was valuable or the rambling of a man slipping in and out of lucidity. A retired orchard worker, a man in his late 70s named Franklin Boyd, had pleaded to speak with law enforcement. He said it concerned the trooper from 54. 2 officers made the drive. When they stepped into his dimly lit room, they found a frail man leaning back against his pillows, struggling for breath. His eyes carried a look that was both frightened and determined, as if he'd been waiting decades for the courage to say what he knew. For a moment, he studied the officers, trying to confirm they were real. Then he closed his eyes and began to speak. He had worked seasonal shifts at the orchard in the 1950s, doing odd jobs, managing irrigation lines, and helping maintain equipment. The night trooper Hensley vanished, Franklin had been near the back edge of the orchard, repairing a leaking water valve long after sundown. He remembered the sounds first, raised voices drifting across the trees, one of them sharp and angry, the other firm and steady. He moved toward the noise, thinking it might be the orchard's owner or someone trespassing. Instead, he reached the clearing near the old fence line and froze. He saw Walter, and he saw the 2 men with him. One man Franklin recognized immediately, Ernest Mallory, the hauling contractor who had purchased the orchard days earlier. The second man was a stranger, taller, moving with tense, quick motions. Franklin couldn't hear every word exchanged, but he understood enough. Walter had pulled them over. Mallory had been transporting illegal moonshine equipment. They had tried to bribe him. He refused, and now they were trying to persuade him to forget what he saw. Franklin described how Walter's posture stayed calm, even then. The trooper didn't reach for his weapon. He simply refused to be bought. That was when things turned. Mallory's accomplice swung first. Franklin remembered the thud of the blow, the way Walter crumpled to the ground without a sound. He remembered how Mallory panicked, pacing, yelling at the other man, asking what they were supposed to do now. The accomplice answered by dragging Walter deeper into the orchard, cursing under his breath. Franklin stayed hidden among the trees, too terrified to move. The men returned minutes later, breathing hard, hauling the trooper's Plymouth behind a heavy truck. They worked quickly, with grim purpose. They had already dug the pit. Mallory had prepared it days earlier for orchard renovations, though Franklin realized now that had been a cover. The pit was wide, fresh, and deep enough to swallow the car whole. Franklin described how they pushed the sedan forward, the engine still warm, the headlights faintly glowing as if struggling to hold on. The workers in a room, listening from the doorway, shifted uneasily. The officers didn't speak. According to Franklin, Walter wasn't dead when they lowered the car. His head rolled when they lifted him. His breathing was shallow, uneven. He was unconscious but alive. Mallory hesitated, saying something about taking the troopers somewhere else, but the accomplice insisted they had no time. He shoved Walter into the driver's seat, slammed the bent door, and told Mallory to finish it. Franklin said Mallory argued weakly, then gave in. Together, the two men covered the car with dirt using the truck's loader. They worked until the headlights were no longer visible, then left in a hurry, driving away down the highway without looking back. Franklin stood there long after they were gone, convinced that if he made a sound, someone would return for him too. He ran home in the dark, shaking, and told no one, not even his wife. He didn't trust the authorities back then, not in a year when illegal hauling and moonshine networks had friends in places ordinary men didn't. He convinced himself silence was survival. But over the years, the memory gnawed at him, settling into the kind of regret that grows heavier with age. The officers listening to the confession felt the weight of every word. They asked Franklin why he had waited so long. He answered with a small, exhausted shrug. Fear, mostly. And shame. He said he'd carried the truth so long that it felt like a second spine, something fused into him that he could never escape. But now, with only days left to live, he couldn't carry it anymore. He wanted the trooper's family to finally know what happened. He wanted someone to write down the truth. Within hours, detectives reopened the case for the third and final time. Franklin's statement was compared to the forensic evidence gathered from the Plymouth 4 years earlier. Everything aligned with chilling precision, of the 24-hour burial window, of the heavy equipment used to cover the pit, of the angle of impact on the roof, the sudden land transfer to Mallory, of the moonshine rumors that surrounded his business, and the missing accomplice whose identity the state would never confirm. Investigators were horrified by the final detail, that Walter had been alive when the burial began. But they also felt a strange sense of relief. The story finally had shape. It had a motive, a timeline, and a chain of events that fit the evidence perfectly. Mallory had died in the early 1970s of liver failure. Records found in another state confirmed he had never returned after leaving in 1955. The second man was never identified, though detectives suspected he had ties to criminal operations outside the county. With no living suspects left to prosecute and no feasible way to locate Walter's remains after so many years underground, the state closed the case for good. The orchard owners, moved by the story, placed a small memorial stone near the tree line where the pit once lay. It bore Walter's name, his badge number, and the date he vanished. Local families began leaving flowers there, even those who hadn't been born when he disappeared. The orchard, once a symbol of unanswered questions, became something quieter, an acknowledgement of what had finally come to light. For Walter's family, the truth did not bring peace, but it brought an ending. Margaret, older now, and carrying the ache of nearly 3 decades of uncertainty, sat quietly when detectives told her the story. She listened to the details, the parts that were painful, the parts that were merciful, and the parts that would stay with her the rest of her life. When they finished, she thanked them softly. She had always feared Walter died alone, surrounded by strangers. Knowing the truth was harsh, but knowing the mystery was no longer endless mattered more. The case had lived in shadows for 24 years. It had resisted searches, outlasted rumors, and survived generations of speculation. But in the end, the truth emerged not from forensic breakthroughs or confessions wrung out under interrogation, but from a dying man who had watched a moment he could never forget. The orchard grew quiet again after the investigation ended. Rows of trees swayed in the wind, the ground leveled, the soil settled. But beneath that quiet, the truth now lived above the earth, no longer hidden in the dark. And for the first time since 1954, the community finally understood what the orchard had held all those years. Not a mystery waiting to taunt them, but a story waiting to be told.